Hello. Well, how's everyone doing? Yeah, the first presentation I ever gave in the Ruby community was at this meetup. Think, when was it? I think it was November 2020, deep in the throes of the pandemic. Yeah, it's pretty mad. But yeah, thanks for having me back. It's great to be back. It's a bit hard for me to join in otherwise because I'm in London and it's about 11:50 here, so it's kind of hard to join when I'm not actually speaking. Um, but yeah, I also just got back from New Zealand last week, and my body clock is being rather frustrating. So if I yawn during the presentation, it's because my body thinks it's probably, I don't know, 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. or something stupid, not because I'm bored. But yeah, just struggling a little bit, but hopefully can still get through this just fine. Let me bring my slides up. Um, can you see my slides? Like, is it full screen?
Yes.
All right, cool. Sorry, I can't see the meetup, but I can see the slides. That's the important thing. Right, so welcome. My talk is titled Native Apps Are Dead, Long Live Native Apps. And so going to be looking at how hybrid apps don't really have such a good reputation, and that's not really deserved, in my opinion, and how Turbo Native can be used to make hybrid apps that don't suck. So it's kind of weird presenting this at a Ruby meetup because there is actually no Ruby code in this presentation, but Turbo Native lives within the Rails ecosystem. So hopefully it'll still be useful. So let's get started. We just take a look at what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about what a hybrid app is and how it compares to a native app. Why they ended up getting such a bad rap, because pretty much everyone I speak to, they just tend to scoff when I mention hybrid apps, and I'm not really sure why. What Turbo Native is, and finally how we can build hybrid apps that not only don't suck but are actually pretty good, because it can be done if you go about it in the right way. So the obligatory bit about me slide. So that's my profile picture that you'll see on all my public socials pretty much. That's me in spirit, sadly not in reality. I can't quite be that rock and roll in reality as much as I'd like, but I can embellish a bit on my social. So that's why I've gone for that kind of caricature. I'm based in London, and I'm a freelance Rails and Ruby developer. So that's my little freelance practice called Radioactive Toy. I also run a mailing list app called Scattergun. It has a focus on privacy and simplicity, and obviously powered by Rails. And finally, I'm on the core team of Bridgetown, which, if you don't know what it is, it's a static and progressive site generator. It was forked from Jekyll initially, but it's got its own life now. And if you haven't checked it out, I'd highly recommend doing so for anything that's not too database driven. So without further ado, let's dive right in and talk about what a hybrid app is. So a hybrid app is one that combines web technologies like HTML, CSS, JavaScript with native APIs. Now, the level to which these two worlds collide, it really depends on what hybrid tool you're using. So it varies depending on your approach. A couple of popular tools are Cordova, which was formerly known as PhoneGap, and React Native. We'll talk about these a bit more, a bit further down the line. But right now, let's take a bit of a detour and go high into the Chinese hills. where there was once a monastery where a distinguished Taoist guru lived with his disciples. And in the evenings, the monks would gather in the great hall to listen to the leader's teachings and to meditate. Um, but there was a stray cat that had adopted the monastery, and each evening it would follow the monks into the hall. It would mewl, it would scratch, and just generally be annoying throughout their silent meditation. So it did this every night until the teacher became so irritated by it that he told his followers to put a collar on the cat and tether it to the far side of the monastery each evening. So that worked well for a while. The teacher, the cat, the monks, they all went through their nightly routine, and everything was going well. Then one day the learned teacher died, but the monks, they still continued to tie up the cat every evening. More years passed, and then eventually the cat died as well. And so the monks, they went down to the nearest village and they bought a replacement cat and they tied that up every evening. And then 2 centuries later, religious scholars, they write learned essays on the importance of tying up a cat prior to evening meditation. So this tale is it's an ancient Buddhist tale, and it's known as the tale of the tethered cat. And the principle it demonstrates is it seems to demonstrate principles that have outlived the conditions that created them. And tech really loves a good tethered cat. Like this is my favorite one. Might seem familiar to a lot of you. Once it gets established, people just seem to take it as gospel. And I believe hybrid apps being inherently bad are a tethered cat. Over the years, I've heard like quite a few falsehoods about hybrid apps, like they're slow, or they don't look native, and I don't know where this one comes from, but they're insecure. I've heard this from so many people over the years because I used to work as an iOS developer before I switched to Rails as well. So um, yeah, they just seemed quite ingrained in the industry, and I'm not really sure how that's happened. Well, one thing is this. Mark Zuckerberg in 2012 said the biggest mistake we've made as a company is betting on HTML5 over native. So, well, if Lord Zuckerberg says it, it must be true, right? So I think like Facebook, because they switched from HTML5 to native and that they shouted so loudly about it, it really served as the basis for establishing this particular tethered cat. In addition to this, let's also look at the tools that I mentioned earlier that are usually used to build hybrid apps. And both of these tools operate on the premise that you have a single shared code base. Now, that doesn't work. That has never worked. That will never work. Like, do you remember Java apps? Anyone? Anyone been around long enough to remember Java apps? I'm sure if you look at your dock or your desktop or whatever now, you won't see many Java apps there. And even if there are the odd Java app, it's probably pretty rubbish. One
Working in Swing a bit. I even made a Ruby app that had a NetBeans powered Java GUI with like GUI like windows and stuff.
I
And
can't
ran in
imagine that
JRuby.
must have been much fun. I can't imagine it would have resulted in a particularly good app either.
It was the best bad option, and it allowed me to make it was a thing I called SQL Converter, which actually for about 10 years was like #1 Google search result for anyone looking to convert Excel CSV files to MySQL. It would do
That's
data
pretty
type
good, actually.
inferencing and then output full SQL schemas.
That's a good effort. I mean, yeah, you do have the odd successful app in like in your case, but kind of scuppers my argument here. But Fair enough. But on the whole, like using a single code base on multiple platforms, generally it doesn't work. And uh, Cordova also builds the entire app's UI using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that means you're not really following platform standards on iOS and Android because the UI has to be the same on both or very similar. And that means your users aren't getting a familiar experience, and that's never going to be good. With the React Native, I think the less I say, the better, because if I start saying more, this talk's just going to descend into an almighty rant. So instead of that, I'm just going to show you the Twitter bio of the former lead developer of React Native. So this is Nick Lockwood. He's changed it now. I had to dig into the Wayback Machine to dig up this older version because I knew he had it there. And he says, partly to blame for React Native, sorry. I think when you get to the point where you're kind of embarrassed about your own work to that level, I think it says a lot about the framework itself. So I think between the tools not being very good or the mainstream tools not being very good, and then Mark Zuckerberg's quote from 2012, I think we've established quite a textbook tethered cat. But before we look into why the principle that hybrid apps are bad may not be quite so relevant in the year 2023, let's take another detour. This time we're going to go into the English countryside. And there was once a man who had a long way to walk to work. And every day he had to go well out of his way because there was a hedge that blocked the most direct route. And every day he walked a mile further in the morning and then again in the evening on his way home because this hedge was in the way. So day after day, he'd look at his hedge and just think, if that hedge wasn't there, I could save myself an hour of walking every day. And then one day he'd had enough and he's like, I'm going to do something about this. And he made a hole in the hedge so he could walk the shorter route and save himself some time. And that was the day that the bull who lived on the other side of the hedge killed him. Now, how a Texas Longhorn bull found itself in the English countryside, I'll leave up to your imagination. It's fiction. Let's just roll with it. So this tale was established by G.K. Chesterton, who was an English writer and philosopher. It's known as the Chesterton's Fence. And this tale serves the purpose to illustrate the rule that don't remove a rule before fully understanding why it was put into place and all the effects its presence has. So let's look at the circumstances which establish the rule that hybrid apps are bad. Well, this quote that I mentioned earlier, this was made in the year 2012. And that's quite a long time ago. And the world of JavaScript and web development is completely different now in 2023. So let's look at what mobile performance was like back when he said this. So this is a speed speedometer test I ran on an iPhone 6, which is the oldest phone I could find in my drawers, and that's 2014. So still 2 years newer than when he made that quote. And this gives a number 24.8. And then I ran the same test on my current device, which is an iPhone 13 mini, which came out a couple of years ago. And it gave me a figure of 349. Now, that is a ludicrous jump. Like, okay, I mean, we're looking at a $600 top of the range phone here, but even so, that jump is just absolutely insane. And it just shows that the world of mobile performance today is just completely different from what it was a decade ago. It's like it's an order of magnitude better. And even if you run the same test on Android phones, they don't give a figure quite that high, but anecdotally, most Android phones will still score about 60 to 100. So you're still looking at 2 to 3 times the score of an iPhone 6 in 2014. So that's still a significant gain. So I think that proves that the circumstances which created the tethered cat no longer apply in 2023. So I think if we were to ignore that rule or remove that rule, I think that's a sensible and safe thing to do. So now that we've established that, let's talk about when we should build a hybrid app, because shock and horror, it's not a silver bullet. Hybrid apps were useful when a server rendered web app with mainly CRUD functions is the beating heart of your product. So if you're using like a full stack framework like Rails, Django, Laravel, where you're rendering HTML on the server and sending that down to the browser, and it's primarily just a CRUD app, which, let's face it, most apps are, then a hybrid app's probably going to be the right approach for you. If you're building something which has like really deep native integration, like an Uber, which needs like location services and a map, and it's quite like deeply integrated with native features, and hybrid's probably not the right approach in that particular case. So you just need to evaluate based on the app you're building whether a hybrid is the right thing for you. So now that we established like the when, let's look at the why. So hybrid apps let you reuse HTML, CSS, and JavaScript from your web app. So this in small teams, it's a huge advantage because you don't have to rebuild every screen natively, and you don't need to build web APIs to serve those data to those native screens. You can just reuse what you already have on the web app, and that's like just a massive advantage because you only need to build stuff once instead of 3 times. You can still use native APIs like push notifications, maps, contacts, etc. So even though like the engine of your app is still the web app, you can still use native APIs, and that's where like the hybrid approach really shines. And finally, you can push updates remotely by just updating the web app. So you can almost bypass the app review process, which is quite opaque, quite capricious, and you just never really know what you're going to get. So if you can just push updates remotely, that's another huge plus point as well. So now that we've established that hybrid apps are not necessarily that bad, when we should build hybrid apps, the case of why, let's look at how we can actually build good hybrid apps. So the better approach is firstly, separate code bases from the get-go. Don't try sharing a code base. It's not going to do any good. So build like the platform standards between like iOS and Android, they're quite different. The UI presents itself differently. Using different code bases just it makes for a better user experience. So in a hybrid context, what you would do is you'd build a fully native backbone using native tech, and then you just render web content within it. So what that means is like your the tab bar at the bottom, as you can see in the diagram, the navigation bar at the top, those are fully native components. But the actual content of the screen itself, that's web. So the user still gets like a familiar experience because like the navigation still looks native. It's just like the actual content that's populated within the screen is web. And then stuff like on iOS, you can swipe the screen to go back a step. Stuff like that just works out of the box. So it's you don't break like familiar interactions that are familiar to native app users. And your app, in essence, it becomes a custom web browser in this case. And that's where Turbo Native fits into the picture. So let's talk about what Turbo Native actually is. It's a native library for iOS and Android. It's written in Swift on iOS and Kotlin on Android. So completely the two different libraries for each platform, and that ties into the earlier point that I made about having two independent code bases. So they're written like using platform standards on both platforms using native APIs, and it extends Turbo on the web, or Turbo Drive especially on the web. So I'm sure most of you have worked with Rails, so you're probably familiar with Turbo, Turbo Drive, and probably Turbo Links that came before that. But let's just quickly look at what Turbo Drive on the web actually does. So when you click a link, Turbo will intercept that link click. And instead of navigating to that page, it uses JavaScript to make a fetch request to the destination and retrieves the destination page. And then it just swaps out the body with the response it got from the fetch request. That's a huge performance advantage. There's a whole bunch of benefits to this that I'm sure you're all aware of, so I'm not going to dig too deeply into it. But conceptually, it's super simple. So how does Turbo Native augment this? Well, when you load a web page for the first time in a Turbo Native app, it installs itself as an adapter to Turbo on the web. How does it do that? Well, both iOS and Android have native APIs that let you communicate with JavaScript and let JavaScript communicate with native. That was a game changer, because what happens is that Turbo Native just evaluates a script on the web page that is loaded and registers itself as an adapter on Turbo. And that lets Turbo Native place itself right in the middle of that request cycle that I just talked about earlier. So now, in a Turbo Native context, when you tap a link in a Turbo Native app, instead of making a fetch request, what it does is it calls a native method on both iOS and Android. And in that native method, you make it's up to the developer to implement, and you make a decision. You either proceed with the default navigation, which we'll get into in a minute, or you can present a fully native screen. This approach is seriously cool, because what it means is you're not all in on the web camp or the native camp at any point. You can progressively enhance as you go. So like let's say you have an app where the user spends like 90% of their time on one screen. Then you might want to build that particular screen fully native, because it's going to be a better user experience. So you could do that with just that one screen and leave the rest of your apps to still reuse web views. And that's really, really cool, because you can like push a slider depending on how far native you want to go or how far web you want to go. You don't have to commit to either approach and then be stuck with it. So that's I think the USP of Turbo Native personally. So what does this transition actually entail? So let's say you have the screen, and when you tap a link on the screen, the first thing that happens is Turbo Native will create a new native screen in the background. Then it will inject the web view that already exists into this new native screen. And finally, you'd call turbo.visit to navigate that web view to the destination path. And then it just pushes that new screen onto the stack, and it's presented to the user. So on iOS, some of this work needs to be done manually, but on Android, quite a lot of it is done under the hood. So the developer actually has to do less work. And also, as you can see, just like the same instance of the web view is reused throughout the flow. So you get like all the performance benefits of Turbo on the web as well, because you're not doing full page navigation, you're just doing Turbo navigation. So it retains that advantage as well. So let's look at what this actually looks like to the user. So I have a Turbo native app here, and this is what it looks like. I mean, for all intents and purposes, that looks exactly like a native app navigation to me. It like all that stuff that showed in the previous slide. It happens in the background. The user is just blissfully unaware. So the eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed that there's a native login button there on the screen. Now, this is a hybrid app, but I hear you ask, how can it have native components? Well, the cool thing is that there is a web to native bridge. Do you remember earlier I said that Turbo Native it attaches itself to Turbo on the web using native APIs that let you execute JavaScript? Well, we can use that same API as well. There's nothing stopping us from doing that. So we can communicate from the web app to the native app and vice versa using these native APIs on both iOS and Android. So let's look at iOS. What you can post messages from JavaScript. So like you can see here that you can do window.webkit.blah, blah, blah, and post a message that's probably just going to be like a JSON message or something. And that triggers this native method where the message is passed through. So then you can do whatever you want in native code with that particular method. So that just opens up a whole world of possibilities. And Android has equivalent methods as well. You can post, and then Android works slightly differently in the fact that you annotate a method with JavaScript interface, and then that method can actually be called using JavaScript. It's slight implementation detail, but in essence, you can trigger native code, or you can send data to native code using JavaScript, and that's super powerful. And you can go the other way as well. So, this is to evaluate JavaScript in native code. So that's a piece of Swift code that's logging something to the console, and the exact same API exists on Android as well. So you can go both ways, and that lets you place all kinds of stuff you want on the native part of the app, but still triggered by the web app. So how are we placing this fully native login button on screen? Well, we create an HTML link on the page, and we'll hide it, and we'll attach a stimulus controller to it called bridge element. We'll look at that in a second. And then we just add some data attributes to define what it does and make it easy to find and stuff. So like the bridge element ID is what's used to find this element on the page. And then you can use bridge element iOS to define just a JSON string that tells the app how to render it. So you can, for more complex components, you might want to add some more data there, but we just want a button. So it's just the type of component on both iOS and Android. Now, as you can see, it's a different component. So again, you're following platform standards. You're rendering stuff the way the user would expect it to be rendered on the platform they're familiar with. So we just define this link in the HTML and attach a stimulus controller to it. So in the stimulus controller, when it connects to the DOM, the first thing we do is we just add a class to make it invisible because we don't want to show it on screen. And then second, we call a render method, which sends a message to native code to tell it render this button. So the bridge element JavaScript class, that's just an encapsulation around the data attributes and to extract the correct data attributes for the platform based on a meta tag. So it's just some logic to encapsulate that stuff. Really, it's no big deal. And the web bridge is it's a construct that uses the adapter pattern to trigger the correct native API. Because, like I said, there's slight difference in the APIs on iOS and Android. So it's just a construct that uses an adapter to trigger the right one based on the platform. We won't dig into the details of that in this talk because it can get quite gnarly, but the essence of what this is doing is it's sending a JSON message to native code with the details about this link or button and saying render this natively. And so once we have native code that receives that message and renders that natively, we need to handle what happens when that button is tapped. And like we use the same API I mentioned earlier to just locate that link using the bridge element ID data attribute. It's called click on it. So you have a fully, and you can do that on Android as well. So you have a fully native button that is rendered using web technology, and that's triggering web technology. So that is just immensely powerful. And you're not restricted to buttons or links or just like a single component. Basically, it's a generic message passing bridge. So you can send whatever message you want as long as your native code knows what to do with it. So you can render any kind of native components around your web content and really enhance the user experience and really level it up. So you're not stuck in like this halfway house where you're trying to fake it using only web components. You can actually render like fully native components and still have them trigger web actions. And that's just super cool. Now, Strata is supposed to help with this. I don't know when Strata will see the light of day, if it'll ever see the light of day, but it's supposed to provide an abstraction layer for this web to native bridge. So hopefully in the future, this will be even easier to do. So before we move on, let's just take a look at what this button looks like in action. So there you go. It's like, so that particular link is configured to present as a modal, which is what comes up to the bottom. But all it's doing is clicking a link. And like you can see, it's just a very familiar native experience to the user. So let's just recap what this bridge does. So you can pass messages from JavaScript to native code and vice versa. You can render fully native components, which still trigger web actions. And it allows rendering of all kinds of native components, menus, buttons, tabs around the web content. World's your oyster. Do whatever you want. And Strata will eventually perform an abstraction layer for this. So before we continue, let's address a burning question. Is this experience going to be as good as a fully native app? Honestly, no, sorry, it's not. I know I mentioned it before, but hybrid's not a silver bullet. It's becoming a cliche, but I think it needs to be said. A hybrid app's good in the right circumstances. It's a tool in your toolbox for the right kind of app. It will be good enough for the most apps, especially server rendered CRUD apps. It will be good enough. When you use it in the right circumstances, it'll do the job. And at the end of the day, honestly, I cannot emphasize this enough. The consumer does not care. They don't care what tech you're using. They just want a good app. Now, I can cite a couple of obvious examples. The flag bearers for Turbo Native, Hey and Basecamp, they have ratings of 4.6. I think that says a lot in itself. But I'm going to illustrate this point a little further with an app that's probably slightly more unexpected, which is the BBC Sport app. Now, this is a hybrid app, which might be surprising to you. It doesn't use Turbo Native, as far as I know, but it uses the exact same approach. It has native navigation, but the content is web. If you don't believe me, go to any BBC Sport URL on your web browser and add .app to it at the end, and you'll see the version that's served up to the app. Now, that has a 4.7 star rating with 464,000 ratings. That is just as strong and a compelling case for this approach as I have ever seen. Now, if you were to compare that to a fully native app, well, you see my point, right? Um, the thing that I'm trying to, the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's possible to build a fully native app that's substandard. Like just using native tech, it doesn't insulate you from making a bad app. You can still do that. You can write bad code with any language, with any framework, with any platform. A fully native app can be shit. And it's also possible to build a hybrid app that's delightful. Hybrid apps don't have to be shit. You can. It's easy to build them badly, but if you just put a little bit of effort into it, it's possible to build really good apps using the hybrid approach that I've spoken about today. Before I wrap up, I have to absolutely shamelessly plug my book. I've written a book on this topic. It's primarily a book on how to build a Rails app. It covers Rails in quite a lot of detail. Every single Rails framework, active storage, blah, 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 all of it's covered. And just as something special, it also covers Turbo Native and how to build the functionality on iOS and Android. So if you want to dig into like Turbo Native, how it works, and actually implement the web bridge that I spoke about today, I go into all that in the book. So it's available for sale. Shameless plug, had to get that out of the way. But thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, happy to answer them. Those are all my socials and stuff. If you want to get in touch with me, you can. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Do you have the source for that bridge element? That's the one from that stimulus controller.
Yeah, I do. It's hold on.
I'm interested to see what that looks like.
Yeah, I covered in my book. So those videos that I showed, those are from the app that I built in the book. The code examples, they're just tweaked and simplified from the book again. Let me just bring up the code repository so I can share the code for that bridge. Do you want the code for the bridge element or the web bridge? I'll just share both. What's a good way to share it? Shall I just paste it in the chat?
That'll work. So I have a very kind of targeted question. My company is going to eventually need some sort of mobile application for when people who use our app are going out in the field where they may not have good cellular service. And I'm trying to think in advance of the best ways to start building this. And I'm wondering, is there a way to go maybe less on the hybrid side and more on just packaging up a web app that can record data, and once it gets back into cellular range or Wi-Fi range, simply submits it? Is that biting off a problem that's going to be awful if I don't look for a more hybrid approach? Or if it is such a simple use case, would I maybe be better served with just getting a very small but native app?
It's tricky because what you could do is, so actually the client that I'm working with at the moment has that exact functionality implemented in the web app using React. So you could like use IndexedDB and just use WebTech to build that functionality, and then using like Turbo Native or something, just build a little app wrapper to wrap around it, and you're just living completely in the web world. That should work. If you want to go down the fully native route, you can do that as well. But then you're looking at a set of you looking at working with the native platform that if you're not particularly experienced with, it can be a bit tricky. Like if you don't have native iOS and Android experience, getting up to speed might be a bit tricky. You might have to bring someone on board, like a contractor or someone who knows native stuff quite well. So it's a tricky question for me to answer just with the information at hand. But that particular use case, I think, is something that's completely achievable with purely web tech, and then you can use a hybrid approach to just put it into an app wrapper.
Yeah, I've actually had to solve that problem, Aaron. And we went with a full native app. And before, it was for tracking employees clocking in and out. And it would check for internet connectivity before it tried making the API posts back to the application. And if it wasn't available, then it just stored the punches within core data, the native iOS's data store. And then once it did reach, next time they performed some kind of activity on that app, it then posted the punches as you would expect. But I think you could do something still with a progressive web application, because that does have offline modes. And if you built that into a hybrid app, then you could still use the core data on the iOS side to kind of handle that. So you get kind of best of both worlds. It's a hybrid app.
Okay. Thanks. You guys are giving me a lot to look into and start Googling.
But I don't know if the WebView frame kit supports progressive apps. That would be a little hiccup.
Mhm.
Does anyone have any feedback on the talk at all? Because it's actually literally the first time I've given this presentation. I didn't even go through a rehearsal. I finished my slides like this morning. I didn't even have time to do a rehearsal. So it's actually the first time I was going through this presentation. So very likely to be rough edges that that I'm blind to. So if you have any feedback, please let me know.
I thought it was great. I really liked your metaphors and examples and tying it back in.
Cheers.
I mean, I really liked it. The only thing I'd have done differently or added to it is like possibly like a playground where somebody can play with stuff and like you just having your slides so we can look at them again. But otherwise, this was really good.
Cool.
I appreciate the honest opinions that you put in there about how you felt about different things. A lot of times we talk around it without saying, this is crap. I really like that you said that.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, I tend to be pretty straight talking, so it does rub some people up the wrong way, but I'm glad you appreciated the honesty.
Definitely, it was much appreciated.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
Can you post a link to your book? Because I see the gists
Yep.
aren't, or your code snippets for the bridge element and bridge aren't there. But if it's available in your book, I'd like to support you on that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's all covered in the book, so that there's a link to it. Oh yeah, the code snippets got trimmed, didn't they? I didn't even realize that. Yeah, the chat message didn't post the full code snippet. I'll create a secret just on GitHub quickly with both those code snippets just to share.
Cool.
I think everybody's brains are still spinning with what you were talking about. We're all still real quiet tonight.
I'll just press the tab here. Here's the gist with the code for the bridge and the bridge element.
Cool. Thank you.
No worries.
I thought you did an amazing job. Thank you so much for speaking today. I enjoyed the examples that you gave and the clear way that you presented it. So I think this was a great talk. I would have never known that you had finished the slides this morning. Would have never known.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I do tend to push things to the last minute. It's still not the worst procrastination I've ever done. There was I gave a presentation at the Scotland Ruby user group back in November when the call had already started when I was still editing my slides, and I was like frantically trying to finish them.
I mean, I hate to tell you, that's a hallmark of having ADHD as a programmer.
Yeah,